Happy Memorial Day and welcome to Saturday's Warrior, the channel where we talk all things BYU and Big 12 and college football. And this last week, a tweet came out showing the EA Sports College Football 25 tier rankings. And it got me thinking, well, what does that say for each conference? You know, if we were to go in and calculate the weighted average of each team by conference, and then we could stack up the conferences against each other. And so that is what we're going to do in this video. But before we do, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. It really does help us grow and help us keep doing what we're doing. So appreciate it. And so now let's jump into our breakdown. All right, so here is the image from the tweet that I referred to at the top of the video, listing every FBS team by these tiers, how EA Sports has them ranked. And you can see that it's based on there at the bottom in the small print, that it's based on final finish in the last 10 AP football polls from 2014 to 2023. And so what I've done is I've added these color bubbles so we can visually see how each of the conferences fared, kind of get a quick visual with the SEC in yellow, the Big 10 in light blue, the ACC in gray, and then that pinkish orange is the Big 12. And then because it took a long time, I didn't do any bubbles for Notre Dame or for the G5 schools, just to save time. We're not going in as much depth on those. We're mostly looking at the Power 5 conferences as we do this. So now let's go through each one and break them down. So the Big 10, I guess is really no surprise that they've got 5 in the Tier 1 and another strong showing there in Tier 2. What also probably does not surprise anybody is that they have several teams down there in that bottom tier. And so what I've done is, and you can check my math, I may have made mistakes transferring things over, but I checked my spreadsheet several times, so I think the numbers are right somewhere. Feel free to point out if I've got an error here in my spreadsheet. But what I did is for Tier 1 times 5 schools and all the way down, Tier 2 times the 6 schools that we have there, and then you add all that up and divide it by the total number of teams, which is 18 teams for the Big 10, starting I think July 1st, and then you get your weighted average. And for the Big 10, it's 2.39. So let's see how that is with the other conferences. Here we've got the SEC. They're a bit better at 2 even, and you can see even though they don't have they're one fewer team in that Tier 1, they have many more teams, several more teams in the Tier 2, and then they're not nearly as many down there in that bottom tier, really weighing them down. And so you can see that the SEC is much more top heavy, whereas the Big 10 is, you got a lot of weight there at the top and then a lot at the bottom and a few in between. And so I think that's the big difference that you see between these two. Then the Big 12, how do they stack up? Oh, interesting. So right there, ahead of the Big 10 and then behind the SEC. For Big 12 fans, this shouldn't be any surprise. Something that I think the conference has really hung its hat on is the depth of the conference and the parity, and that any given week, any team can, win, and, trying to predict the outcome of who the two teams, let alone the conference champion, is going to be at the end of a season is nearly impossible, just because there's so much chaos that goes on. And that is what we love. That is something, the best kind of college football that we're looking at. And again, only one team down there in the Tier 4, very heavy there in Tier 2, even though they're not quite as, don't have quite this showing at Tier 1. Utah is going to love this up there, and Oklahoma State. Those are the two schools that are right now projected to win the Big 12 this upcoming season. But looking at all of the depth that's there, really anything could happen. I was surprised that Texas Tech was that low, and Colorado probably benefited a lot from this last season because they have been a bottom dweller for the last several years. So this is the Big 12, strong showing. And then the ACC, out of the Power Four conferences, is there at the bottom with only one team in Tier 1. And again, another strong showing there for Tier 4. What's crazy is that UVA even went to a New Year's Six bowl and still ended up at a Tier 4. And that wasn't even enough to get them to a Tier 3. Just crazy that's how bad they've been on all those other seasons. And so looking at this, for the most part, it makes sense. Florida State is right there at the top of Tier 2, but not quite at the Tier 1. And so, again, pretty strong there in the middle, but it's just really has all those teams weighing it down at the bottom. So again, let's compare all of them. So first, now the G5, that's basically everyone that's not covered and is quite a bit lower than all the others. And so comparing them, let's look at this. Big 12, I think, is what stands out to me here, is that not only are they ahead of the Big 10, but way ahead of the ACC. So for those saying that, Utah is going to go from the Big 12 to the ACC, yeah, maybe that's fine. Let them go. That would change this formula a bit, especially with them at Tier 1. But you just look at the depth there with the Big 12 versus all those teams you have anchoring in the ACC. So for everybody that says, oh yeah, it's a Super 2 and the Big 12 is irrelevant, to me this says otherwise. So now I do want to do a little comparison of what that says, or how the conferences were prior to all this realignment that was happening. So I'm going back in time to 2022. And yes, I realize that these rankings are based off of seasons that go through 2023. And so this isn't exactly how those rankings would have looked if they had stopped at this season. But since I don't have all their numbers and everything, I'm just strictly going off of this ranking for college football 25. So looking at this, here was Big 10. You see a little bit of shift. Obviously, they go down because they've lost some, the 4 Pac-12 schools that they've added. But otherwise still a pretty good ranking. The SEC loses Oklahoma and Texas, so they actually go down a little bit as well. And then the Big 12 actually goes up a little bit, which makes sense. Even trading out Utah and Oklahoma so they stay even at the Tier 1, you are, losing 2 blue blood programs, but the fact that they stayed pretty consistent by adding those other schools, I think says a lot about the conference and what they were able to do in rebuilding itself. And then the ACC, what I think is funny is their score actually goes up when they don't include those 3 new schools, which you can see SMU is at Tier 3. Stanford was actually Tier 2, but then you have Cal down there in the Tier 1. So they actually do better. And now let's look at what the Pac-12 would have looked like. Actually, a very good score. I think pretty similar to, we'll look on in a couple slides, I think, to what the Big 10 is for this upcoming season. So very strong. It's unfortunate, again, that we had to lose one of our long-standing conferences in college football due to all this realignment. But again, Big 12 is and other conferences, Big 10, have both benefited from it. So, and then the G5, obviously the score goes up a little bit because here you're including several of the schools that moved up to the P5, and so they're obviously losing a lot of their teams there in the Tier 2, which were some of the top G5 schools that were able to get pulled up to the P4 rankings. So including, BYU, Cincy, UCF, and who am I missing? But anyway, Houston. So G5 actually improved. So now let's look at this. The Big 10 goes down a little bit by losing those West Coast schools. The SEC goes down a little bit. Yeah, you just lost 2 blue bloods, OU and Texas. Big 12, their score actually improves just a little bit, but again, they had those same 2 blue bloods in OU and Texas. And then the ACC, also improves by not adding Stanford, Cal, and SMU. Again, looked like a desperation move. And then the G5, they improve because, again, they keep all those schools that had just moved up. And then the PAC, I went ahead and put in they averaged 3 because both Washington State and Oregon State were in tier 3. And so that's what they would be at, the Pac-2. But going back to last year, very strong, even a higher score than what Big Ten has this year. So again, a shame, but even when those conferences were there and everyone was saying, oh, Big 12 was at the bottom, again, well ahead of the ACC, which was tied with the Big 12 there, or sorry, the Big 10 there at the bottom, and then still ahead of the Pac-12. So it's interesting how people's perception of the Big 12 is not necessarily aligned here with the data that the EA Sports was using to put into the game. And so now I want to take one more step back, all the way before all this crazy realignment, back to 2010, and take a look at how the conferences were for a long time. And the Big Ten, this one's hilarious to me because they added several schools, Rutgers, Maryland, and Nebraska, and all 3 of them were at tier 4. So by removing them, their score actually jumped drastically. Now, again, I recognize that all of these rankings came after 2010, and that Nebraska, had they stayed in the Big 12, where their traditional recruiting base was, likely would have performed better and would have been in a higher tier. At least we can assume. There's no way of knowing. This is a counterfactual, and so we have to take this with a grain of salt, but I think it is telling to show, okay, if the Big Ten still existed today as it looked in 2010, how might its ranking in EA look? And so that's kind of what I'm doing. So there's only so much stock we can put in this, but I still think it's interesting to look at. And so again, doing better by not adding Maryland and Rutgers, and then even Nebraska, surprisingly, which were all anchors to them in this realignment process. The SEC, on the other hand, went down, but just slightly, essentially stayed the same before and after adding Mizzou and Texas A&M, who were both there in a tier 2. And Big 12 actually goes down by including Nebraska. Again, maybe they would have performed better had they stayed. And then they've also got Colorado, Mizzou, A&M in there, really going back to that original Big 12 makeup. And then the ACC, still there at the bottom of these power conferences. I guess there's not a whole lot more to say to that. I mean, this doesn't include those Big East teams that are primarily there, I think, along the second tier. And so that is how it shakes out for them. And then looking at the Pac, again, losing Utah and Colorado more or less evens out. And then the Big East, because we're going back to 2010, this is how they would have been actually higher than I would have expected, especially with Rutgers there in the basement and having no tier 1 schools, but really strong and heavy there in that tier 2. And with a few schools, there's more weight to those. And so really came out with a strong showing. And then here's the G5 at that point in time. And so now looking at it, we could see, like I said, the Big Ten goes up a lot by not having those schools that they added. SEC mostly the same. The Big 12 does take a little bit of a hit, which I think was a large part due to Nebraska and Colorado even. And then the ACC, drops, but again, still right there at the bottom of these power conferences. The G5, pretty consistent. Pac also did not drop too far, but definitely benefited from adding Utah and Colorado. That was a strong move. And Utah is another one when I talk about this being a counterfactual. Utah was a very good G5 program, or was it G6 at the time? But they continued to build off of that, and being in the Pac-12 obviously helped them. Would they have been as good, or TCU, would they have been as good had they stayed in the at the G5 level? It's hard to say, and there's no way to say, and so but just assuming that they continue to have a positive trajectory, obviously it was a strong addition for the Pac-12. And then the Big East there, still coming in ahead of the Pac-12, which surprises me because the Big East was always thought of as the bottom of those Power 6 conferences. And then here's one for me, because I always had, going back to 2010 when BYU was in the Mountain West, I always had a bone to pick because I felt like the Mountain West was overlooked, that often many years they were better than the Big East, and some years as good as the ACC. These rankings don't necessarily support that, but it does show that they are well ahead of the G5 average and definitely pull it up. And I mean, when you look at this, you've got there at the top of the conference, yeah, there's a lot of dead weight there down at the bottom, but at the top of the conference, you've got Utah, TCU, BYU, who are all now in the Big 12 in a power conference, and then San Diego State, who was in the mix for both the Pac-12 or the Big 12 last summer. So that was the top of the conference. So you can see that really is what propelled that conference forward. And so when you look at it, yeah, it's behind some of the others, but not so far behind the ACC. And that was a power conference. And so very interesting to look at these side by side and compare and say, had these conferences stayed as they were in 2010, obviously the rankings would be a little bit different. The teams benefit from or to their detriment being in a new conference with new foes, different level of difficulty, new recruiting bases, and whatnot. So it is a counterfactual, but it's still very interesting to have these side by side and compare. So what do you think of the EA Sports tier rankings and what it says about each of the power conferences? Do you buy that Utah and Iowa should be up there with the Blue Bloods in tier 1? And do you really think that the Big 12 should have a higher ranking, a higher weighted average than the Big 10, who has really high teams, but also a lot of dead weight there at the bottom? Let me know your thoughts on this whole system and the ranking and what it says about all the conferences in the comments. Again, please like the video and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Go Cougs!